When I first learned that I was going to be standing here and talking to this bountiful room of people, I thought to myself, no problem. Always the center of attention as an only child, at least that's where I'd find myself. Thought I would be totally comfortable and it would be no problem. Having done probably hundreds of presentations, loving speech writing, I didn't know that what I was going to end up with was 2 notebooks full of reflections, of looking back at the 30 years of my life and my experience as a transgender man. It took me a while to try to decide how I was going to tell this story. And if I think about it now, as I stand here, even in the moment, the number one word that comes to my mind is unlearning. Unlearning gives us the opportunity to take back all the things that we learned, that we absorbed, that came into our lives before we were able to have the words to describe it, the voices to challenge those things, or the ability to see a different way of being. I'll start with a story that's one of my very first, if not my first memory as a child. Shopping with my mom, the inevitable tug came on the back of her shirt saying, "Mom, I gotta go to the bathroom." We walked up to the counter, a lovely woman pointed us to the back corner of the store, and off we went. And when we got there, it was the men's washroom. And this may have been because of my short, curly red hair, or maybe the way I boldly asked, "Where's the washroom? I gotta go." But in that moment, when we got there, I don't remember the words that were spoken. I don't remember any of that. But what I do remember is the angst of not understanding why I wasn't where I was supposed to be. Especially given that all I had to do was go to the washroom. I tell you this story not as some kind of clue to the life that I would eventually lead, but as an example of the ways and how early those memories form, how profound they can be, and how we begin to navigate our identity so young. And we fit into the mold of a culture that we didn't create, but that we had arrived in. For me, learning and unlearning has always been intimately tied to challenge. This is a pattern that has moved throughout my life, described early as a precocious child who would ask questions, who would demand answers, who never took words of people telling me that that's just the way it was at face value. I began through my life, there were many moments of challenge where I challenged myself to expand my world. And that's one of the things that I found helped me to move through that journey of unlearning. At 14, instead of walking the 10 minutes to the high school in the small town where I grew up, I decided that I was going to take a 2-hour-long bus ride to go to a high school in the city where I would have more opportunity to meet people different from myself, to explore a world that until then was kind of foreign to me. I wanted to always find bigger spaces. Because when you find bigger spaces, you find more areas for your identity to form inside of those spaces. You find more opportunity to see examples and representations of other lives that are being lived. And sometimes you find examples that resonate with your own story. At 20, instead of going straight to university, I packed up my Volkswagen Golf and I drove across the country to Vancouver. I remember one of the first days that I was in Vancouver, not having yet accepted my sexuality. Friends took me on a little tour of the city to get to know the neighborhoods and understand where I was. And we ended up in the West End of Vancouver. A street lined with rainbow flags. I walked as a 20-year-old down the street wondering, are all these people gay? Do they know I'm gay? How do I live here? And that's what I did. For the first 8 years that I lived in Vancouver, I made the West End my home, the Davie Village. I had my first heartbreak there. I decorated my first apartment there. I went to my first gay bar there. Always a pivotal moment in any young life. And what I found as I grew a network of friends, which can be very challenging in this city, I found a way to explore who I was by putting myself in a new place, expanding a world, giving myself more opportunity to discover who I am. And that journey took some time. But towards the end of my 20s, I started to feel that same kind of angst, that same feeling in my belly that I wasn't living as authentically. I wasn't comfortable with who I was. I couldn't just breathe. Towards the end of my 20s, I went on what now seems like it might be a once-in-a-lifetime trip with a few of my very closest friends. We traveled in England to Scotland and over to Ireland. And one night, after finding the bottom of a few too many pints of Guinness, honesty is the best policy, right? Conversation came up. I'd spent 3 weeks feeling total freedom, laughing, having fun, exploring, adventuring, opening up that world with some of the people in my life that I felt the most comfortable around, the most myself, the people that you don't have to think before you speak around because all of the weird things you say are hilarious to them. And that's important because that context set the stage for that evening. And no lies, I said, I want to get my hair cut. At that point, for most of my life, I'd had long hair and a ponytail, and I held on to that tightly because for me, that was the femininity that I was holding on to tightly, having grown up with words like dyke and butch. I wanted to be gay, and I was getting there and being comfortable with who I was. But I didn't want to be too gay. I still had this feeling in my mind, this thought in my mind of rising to the standards of what is expected of a woman in the world. And those expectations, I think now more than ever we realize, are so high. They're so narrow too, aren't they? I brought up wanting to cut my hair. And my friend Carly said, my scissors are in my purse. So all of a sudden I said, oh God, they're going to call my bluff. And within a few minutes, we'd put a chair in the bathroom of the hotel, and we were cutting off my hair. Bless Carly, it was a horrible haircut. Horrible. But if you ask any of those three of my friends, they will say that when I looked in the mirror, they saw a weight come off my shoulders and a smile come over my face. That was not just for my new horrible haircut, but it was the weight of a burden that I'd carried for years, trying to be something that I wasn't, trying to hold desperately onto something that made me feel validated, that made me feel like I was who I was supposed to be in the world. Some people refer to this as almost like a performance. Always a person who is a self-described people watcher. I felt like I studied how I should be instead of just being able to breathe into who I was. That moment that I looked in the mirror, all of a sudden it felt like things had just kind of pulled away. I thought, great, got a nice new haircut. Well, eventually I would. My curly hair blowing in the breeze, a newfound freedom. And what I actually got was the first step of another journey completely. See, if you think of sexuality and gender as a home, sexuality is kind of the walls of that house. Gender is the foundation. From the moment we're born, that foundation is given to us. And so it takes some time. It takes some time to get to that place in your life where you begin to be able to verbalize, to challenge, to take those things that people say, oh, it's just the way it is, and start to turn it around and say, not for me. Not for me, it's not. Over the course of the next few years, people would come into my life at magical times. They say that happens. The older you get, the more you think that all of those silly little sayings, that quotes and sayings that people share, the more you realize they're incredibly true. It would take me a few years, but after cutting my hair, it was almost as if a filter had been removed from my life. Instead of holding on to something that the world told me I should be, I started to rebuild that life. Unlearning, challenging those ideas, those norms, those things that were taught. I began to pull that apart, and what I found was that I had come up with ways of avoiding, of minimizing, and of punishing myself for being something that I wasn't. And it was scary. Coming out of one closet is hard enough. Coming out of two, the second feeling like an even bigger one, especially given lack of understanding, sometimes a lack of empathy, but mostly because people just have a hard time understanding how that works. And I tried to find an answer to give you, but I realized that the only answer I can give you is my story. By the time I got to the end of my 30s, not to the end of my 30s, I'm not that old yet. Oh, heavens. To the end of my 20s. To the end of my 20s. By the time I got to the end of my 20s, I'd started really listening to myself. I'd started really understanding, hearing the things in my head that were telling me to be something other than who I was. And that process of unlearning helped provide new language to old emotions that I'd pushed down. Always someone who thinks very logically, 1 + 1 = 2. I'm this, so I should be that. I started pulling those things apart and started challenging the very core of what the world told me I was. We can't challenge those things if we can't find the courage to ask the questions. And so, while those questions may be big or small, they may be in the middle of your life or the beginning of your life or at the end of your life, there are always ways that we can tune in to who we are, to listen to those voices in our head that tells us something other than what is authentic to who we are. I think the more that we learn to accept and embrace who we are, the more we admire, the more we encourage, the more we give that space for other people to find that in themselves. If I think about it, a life of unlearning is about challenging. It's about pushing back against things that don't fit you, that don't suit you. And there's a journey that we can all take to unlearn in our lives. It may not result in a name change or hair on your chin, but it may just lead to a life better lived. Thank you.